George Herbert Walker Bush. The CIA director came jauntily into the Panamanian embassy in Washington just before noon. It was December 8, 1976, about a month after the Republicans lost the presidential election. Torrijos knew that things would change with the arrival of President Jimmy Carter. He wanted our intelligence contacts with the new administration to be strong. He hoped my meeting with Bush, besides putting to rest the nonsensical charges about the bombings, would serve as a bridge to Carter that would lend further progress to the Panama Canal negotiations. "Good to see you," I told Bush, shaking his hand. "General Torrijos sends his regards." I was struck immediately by the fact that Bush came alone to the embassy. His driver, if he had one, aides and interpreter were not there. He carried no papers, not so much as a pen and pad of paper. Aha, I thought, no witnesses. Bush was already well acquainted with Aquilino Boyd, whom he knew would do the translating for us. The three of us sat down in an anteroom of the embassy and engaged in a little chat before lunch. Substance was humorously lacking. Bush needed to be assured that I was not going to spill the real story of the U.S. involvement in the bombings. Yet he needed to do so gently. "So," he said, "have you done a report on the bombings?" What he meant, I am sure, was I hope you haven't written a real report about what we did. "Yes, I wrote a report and sent it to General McAuliffe," I told him. I understood this to mean, don't worry, we're not talking. It indicated that I had kept the information limited to what was already known and directed the facts to the diplomatically proper channel, the corresponding U.S. military authorities. "And he received the report?" Bush asked. "Yes, I made sure of that," I said. Boyd never knew what to make of this conversation. After his contacts with the U.S. Embassy, he had expected some fireworks. Instead, he heard neither recriminations from Bush nor complaints and denials from me about our role in the bombing. In addition, he knew that my mentioning of McAuliffe was strange. The head of the Southern Command had nothing to say about the National Guard's role in the bombing. Yet Boyd would be the sole witness and would be able to tell other diplomats that there had been a meeting on the bombing. Although, he might add, nothing important had taken place. After this cryptic conversation, we were called to lunch and joined by our ambassador to Washington, Nicolas Gonzalez. Bush was relaxed, happy, and friendly during lunch. The only substance to our chat was when he asked solemnly, one soldier to another, if what he had heard was true. "Is Torrijos a communist?" "I assure you he is not," I answered. "It doesn't mean anything. He's no communist. He's a Panamanian, and that's as far as it goes." This was all light conversation in the course of lunch, and despite the nature of the question, Bush was at ease and relaxed, changing the subject frequently. "This embassy is one of the great old buildings of Washington," he said. "I really wish I knew more about Panama and its history." "You're always welcome to visit," I said. "General Torrijos and I would be pleased to welcome you." "You know, I'm particularly interested in the Panama Canal," the CIA director said. "How does it work?" After Bush left, Boyd was clearly befuddled. There was no mention of the U.S. criticism of Panama for allegedly planting the bombs in the canal zone, he said. What, then, was the purpose of the lunch? He'd expected an angry meeting with charges and threats, not the diplomatic display he had witnessed. I told him not to worry, that everything was just fine. Bush had gotten the message. Sometimes, among intelligence operatives, no more than a word or a glance is needed to have a full understanding. All of my subsequent contacts with Bush were cordial, as was evident in a photograph that has been mightily suppressed by the U.S. government. The occasion was a courtesy call Bush was making as vice president in December 1983 at Omar Torrijos International Airport. I had been Armed Forces Commander for only several months. The meeting was ostensibly intended to brief President Ricardo de la Espriella on U.S. plans in Central America. In fact, I was attending to other duties and had not expected to see Bush. But on his arrival, I got a special request that Bush himself was asking to see me to pay his respects. "General, it's good to see you again," Bush said when I arrived late at the VIP meeting room in the airport. Bush was ebullient and warm in his greeting, since I was the only person among the Panamanians he had met before. We were paired up, the future president and future pariah, side by side. The visit lasted less than half an hour. Then Vice President Bush pulled me aside. He congratulated me for having been named Commander-in-Chief and made a subtle reference to his request that the United States be allowed to use the Panama Canal Zone as a base for its counterinsurgency operations in El Salvador. "I hope you'll be supporting my old friends," Bush said. "Our pilots are already chosen and ready to start flying." Neither one of us realized it, but the pilots included such men as Jorge Canalias, Floyd Carlton Caceres, Cesar Rodriguez, and Teofilo Watson, future cocaine traffickers transporting Contra weapons in exchange for cocaine. They would later accuse me of dealing drugs. I was noncommittal. Bush and company left Panama, and my memory of him is vague and distant. As they say about George Bush the man, the meeting was so unmemorable that it did not even cast a shadow. At the time, however, the Iran-Contra operation was already in full swing. Later, El Salvadoran right-wing zealot and death squad organizer Roberto da Buisson, who was far too right-wing for me, but with whom I maintain an ongoing debate about Central America, told me that Bush had flown to El Salvador to meet with him in San Salvador right after our Panama encounter. "He gave his blessing and a pledge of financial support to our operations," da Buisson told me, using the word operation as a substitute for what he was thinking about, his plan to murder thousands of political opponents and leftists in an anti-communist frenzy. Bush and the Americans knew very well that da Buisson was the real power. They didn't care until successful protests in the late 1980s made it expedient for them to keep da Buisson at a distance. What we all know about George Bush is diabolical, even without his dealings with Iran-Contra. Here is a man who, as a pilot in World War II, committed a war crime by shooting at lifeboats containing the survivors of 2 Japanese fishing boats he sank in the Pacific Ocean. The material is all on the record, and if the U.S. media weren't so predisposed to worshiping their cold warriors, this truth, not my testimony, would have sunk Bush a long time ago. I am fascinated by the way history repeats itself. Bush, proving his cowardice by attacking helpless lifeboat survivors in World War II, took just as cowardly a move in the invasion of Panama. I can see the young face of George Bush, dive-bombing a Japanese fishing boat, frightened but hoping that others will see it as proof of his manhood. And then I can see the older, mature George Bush on national television speaking of the evil of Panama, ordering stealth bombers to destroy a non-existent enemy in Panama and manufacturing a mass version of his insecure vision of an evil empire challenging his manhood again. In English, they call it the wimp factor. I am sure that this man's wimp factor will never allow him rest. Once a wimp, always a wimp. That is little solace to me, of course, but I can compare my emotional balance with his. I have a quality of measuring my emotional and mental reflexes in times of stress. During the invasion, under fire by guerrillas in the mountains, during a coup attempt, when I should have been killed. And I recognize stability within myself through times of trial, sensing only some natural rage at the grotesque figure of George Bush sending brave, innocent American boys to kill so that he can defeat his cowardice. Yes, I resent the actions of a man within a system that can do what has been done to me, but I am also interested by the psychological profile it reveals, and I am committed to fight for historical truth, which still can rally me to victory. With Ford, Bush, and Republicans temporarily retired from the scene, we started making quick progress toward a Panama Canal Treaty with the new Carter administration. By the end of 1977, we were close to ratification of what was to become known as the Torrijos-Carter Treaties. These treaties would guarantee full Panamanian sovereignty over the Panama Canal and U.S. abandonment of all its military bases, along with the U.S. Southern Command in Panama, by the year 2000. It was a monumental victory for Torrijos, for Panama, and for the forces of anti-colonialism. But ratification involved approval by the U.S. Senate, and we had our doubts about the resolution. It was difficult for us to believe that we had succeeded so quickly in rewriting the 75-year-old treaty. Considering all the anti-Panama, anti-treaty sentiment, we were not all sure we would win, and we were prepared for the worst. Torrijos had come up with a secret contingency plan, nothing less than a fully developed scheme to set off explosive charges to temporarily block traffic in the Panama Canal. I know of only a few people who were aware of this alternative at the time. On the general staff, Torrijos, Colonel Armando Abel Contreras, and me. The contingency operation, codenamed Huele a Quemado, was neither conceived as a guerrilla operation nor a prolonged battle plan. It was a single event to demonstrate the consequences of a negative vote by the United States. For logistical reasons, the operation had several branches with independent teams. High Road was the group that would operate on the Atlantic. Low Road, the group that would operate on the Pacific. In between them, at Gatun Lake and Pedro Miguel, and from Pedro Miguel to Miraflores Locks, we set up another team, the Mamati, disguised as innocent fishermen whose boats carried French rocket launchers. There was also a demolition team that would take out the transoceanic Panama-Colón Railway. Each was operating separately. No operation team was in touch with the other, and the discovery or failure of any one team would not affect the other. The leaders of the operation were key members of the military, men who later became high-ranking government officials, diplomats, and businessmen, still prominent and active into the 1990s. The leader of the High Road team, for example, was a specialist in nighttime military insurgency and had studied how to neutralize U.S. aircraft on the ground at Albrook Airfield if that became necessary. The Low Road included a contingent from the Pumas de Tocumen Company. I won't mention the name of the commander because its revelation could hurt him in his present assignment. The men on the Low Road slipped right past U.S. roadblocks, 200 men who lived for 2 months right under the noses of the Americans on land owned by a Panamanian engineer named Julio Arcedo, who agreed to their presence although he knew nothing of their plans. The American forces never knew that the innocent-looking Panamanian peasants behind their security cordon were really explosives operatives and frogmen ready to assault the canal. These are specialists in all sorts of commando activities, men trained in Israel for just such operations, forming an elite corps. I was impressed and proud as I observed several dawn-to-dusk training sessions conducted in absolute silence and security in the field. It was like a movie, but there we were, watching the special operatives reach their objective and then head off, dripping wet, into the night. These men brought honor to Panama and to the oath and allegiance they swore before Torrijos, Lucinio Miranda, Nivaldo Madrinan, and Luis Cuyel, with units from the Department of National Investigations. Daniel Delgado and Felipe Camargo with troops from the Pumas Battalion. Porfirio Caballero with his technology squad, the renowned Edilberto Macho del Cid, leader of the Machos of Monte Special Forces, Fernando Quesada of La Chorrera Barracks, and Virgilio Mirones with his diving specialists and all the soldiers under his command. As the U.S. Senate prepared to vote, all was ready. A signal was to be broadcast throughout Panama on Radio Liberty during the program of the popular radio personality Danilo Caballero. He was to announce a show segment, Boleros de Ayer, as the signal to proceed, or Boleros de Ayer has been canceled, to suspend the operation. It was a historic moment for Panama, but nothing was so tense as the moment facing these men, who had trained and infiltrated U.S.-occupied territory, thoroughly prepared to sabotage the canal if ordered to do so. Hearts were pounding as they waited, and then the news came. The U.S. Senate ratified the Panama Canal Treaties by a 2/3 vote. The signal to suspend our operation was given. The tension, the adrenaline levels needed physically and psychologically to carry out this huge act of destruction had been so high that the men, feeling the release of tension, were disappointed, and some even wept as they prepared to withdraw. One sidelight to the announcement was that Torrijos waited for the results in his office at headquarters, accompanied by President Aristides Royo and TV personality Barbara Walters. Torrijos was ebullient after the Senate confirmation. I remember looking up from the patio to the stairs above as the threesome made their way toward me. "Noriega, get the men out of there," he shouted, wanting to make sure that our sabotage contingency would not take place. "Make sure of it." "Yes, Comandante," I said, but I was shocked that he would mention such a sensitive matter in front of a journalist. Apparently, Walters didn't realize what he was referring to and didn't follow up. Within moments, Torrijos was announcing the approval of the treaties in a nationwide television and radio broadcast. Spontaneous celebrations broke out all over Panama. And in the middle of his remarks, there was a special elliptical mention of those unsung Panamanian patriots. "To those men who know what I'm talking about, I direct a special word of recognition for the great deed they performed by doing nothing at all." As celebrations broke out throughout Panama, the United States never knew what we had planned, or that one way or another, they would have lost the canal. We had been in control all along. After that, despite periodic reports in the U.S. news media pumped up by American officials, there was never any plan ever again to threaten the canal. The canal was now ours, and come what may, it makes no sense to destroy your own house. Someone might have suggested it at one point, but I can honestly say that such a proposal was always immediately shot down. This canal was now a national asset. The only attack there ever could have been on it would have been some kamikaze operation by terrorists. We did everything we could to prepare for such a contingency. Any attack on the canal would have been opposed by all the means available to the Panamanian Defense Forces. On the one-year anniversary of the canal treaties, there was an official celebration in Panama City. Torrijos did not attend. He felt something was missing, that the true demand for Panamanian independence had not been answered. Our future was still under a security umbrella put up by the Pentagon. Following the treaties, Panama kept up conversations with the Japanese. Shigeo Nagano, the Tokyo businessman who had led the earlier Japanese commercial mission to Panama, came for another visit, and I took him to the western part of the country. We were still examining the possibilities of a sea-level canal. This had become more and more pressing as we saw reports about larger and larger ships being built, so large that they had to travel around the tip of South America through the Strait of Magellan. We became more interested in alternatives. We began evaluating specific sites. We took a helicopter to look at the hills toward Chorrera, and Torrijos named the spot where we stopped Nagano Heights. The Americans sought to diminish and limit the Japanese presence in this enterprise. Japanese interests did not diminish. Our site studies included ecological evaluation and geological surveys, while the Japanese studied market conditions, the current size of shipments in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, future projections, existing fleets and capacities, and the development of container shipping and how it was likely to change, along with technical development that would have an impact on shipping in the 21st century. By 1985, Panama, Japan, and the United States had created a formal commission, the Tripartite Study Commission on Alternatives to the Panama Canal. It was an international agency whose responsibility was to find means of improving the existing canal, faced with concern that it would otherwise be rendered obsolete. The commission was envisioned under the canal treaties, which gave Panama the right to choose the third member of the commission, be it Japan, Germany, or some other partner. But the Americans always came along as part of the bargain. They were not at all interested in making anything of this commission, preferring to impose their own decisions on us. But once Japan entered the picture, they had to consider the situation seriously. I was invited to Japan in December 1986 to discuss the process of developing alternatives. In a speech before the Japan-Panama Friendship Association, I took the opportunity to criticize the United States for delays in making improvements to the canal. In particular, I noted, the United States was delaying plans to widen the so-called Culebra Cut, a narrow portion of the canal, a project that would allow broader berth ships to transit safely. This situation is regrettable, above all when we see that several sectors in Japan have made known their interest in contributing to the financing and execution of this work. It was evident that our concern was well-founded. Either there would have to be a new canal or improvements on the one we already had. There was much sentiment that the idea of a sea-level canal was too complicated and much too expensive. Nevertheless, engineering analysis took into consideration complicated factors. For example, the minimum acceptable level of water in Gatun Lake, the source of water that controls the canal locks. There were various analyses of different routes according to physical characteristics and other factors. Each plan had to be considered in the context of the technical requirements of the shipping industry. In that field, Japan had practically all the information. They were the leaders in tankers and tanker technology, and they were making considerable advances in containerized freight. Meanwhile, the Japanese were forceful in calling for constant evaluation of ecological factors, preserving the ecological and biological species of whatever route might be considered. The question was, could we push the Americans to allow us to increase maximum capacity in the canal, so that when we took control of the waterway, we would be able to handle the largest ships possible? Our efforts toward cooperation with Japan might pressure the United States into action. There was a game being played here. As soon as the treaties were signed, the Americans backed off on work to improve the locks and entryways to the canal. They kept up their routine dredging and maintenance work, but they no longer dedicated themselves to the canal's improvements as they once did. The attitude seemed to be, we'll turn over the canal, but we'll turn it over the way it was when we signed the treaty, without anything extra. All the while, from the formation of the Commission throughout the final years before the 1989 invasion, the Americans sought every opportunity to pressure Japan to back off and not support Panama. We were stuck in a sphere of influence inherited from the last year of our creation as a country, in 1903. We realized that we had to extend our alliances beyond the Americans. This ran counter to American interests, which sought to turn over the canal but continue controlling Panama. They didn't want to see an independent Panama making deals with Asia. Throughout the entire period from the earliest talks to the formation of the commission, I focused on the canal studies. My brother Julio, an engineer, was a member of the study commission. He was closely involved in the technical reporting on the system. We saw that the Japanese worked enthusiastically on the project. The Americans knew that Japan saw Panama as a key link in its global development plan. The Panama Canal was a launching pad for exports to Latin America and Europe. The Japanese always maintained a basic level of support for Panama, but in the final years, they sometimes did so at a very discreet level. They backed off in their economic support because the pressure from the United States was great, but they continued to extend loans, maintain exports, and keep up strong diplomatic contacts. For public consumption, the United States saw nothing wrong with Japanese industry and commerce providing technical know-how for canal studies. But under Reagan and Bush, there was something else at work. These men saw me as an obstacle because I was working on something that could unite Panama and free it from American economic dependence. Secretary of State George Shultz was a former executive of the multinational construction company Bechtel. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger had been a Bechtel vice president. Bechtel would have liked nothing better than to earn the billions of dollars in revenue that canal construction would generate. They were naturally interested in serving as a counterpoint to any Japanese initiatives to build a new canal. I wonder if Americans think it's extraneous to analyze the economic precedents of the Panama invasion and the fact that two American cabinet members, not to mention many lower-ranking officials, had economic interests that conflicted with Panama's attempt to broaden its commercial relationship with Japan. I wonder if they think it's all a big coincidence that I was a bad guy and the well-intentioned Reagan and Bush administrations had a good reason for attacking me and destroying Panamanian sovereignty. The Reagan and Bush administrations feared the possibility that Japan might dominate an eventual canal construction project. Not only was there a misplaced concern about security, there was also the question of commercial rivalry. U.S. construction firms stood to lose billions of dollars. The government camouflaged that concern by saying that vital national security interests were involved in the Panama Canal. I want to make it very clear. The destabilization campaign launched by the United States in 1986, ending with the 1989 Panama invasion, was a result of the U.S. rejection of any scenario in which future control of the Panama Canal might be in the hands of an independent, sovereign Panama, supported by Japan. The Americans, of course, would say that I only do things for personal profit. But here we have a case in which I was working for nationalistic reasons with the Japanese. There was no financial gain involved. Americans like Shultz and Weinberger, meanwhile, masquerading as officials operating in the public interest and basking in popular ignorance about the powerful economic interests they represented, were building a propaganda campaign to shoot me down. Under the Panama Canal Treaties, U.S. superintendency of the canal was to expire on December 31, 1989. Dennis McAuliffe, the Southern Command General turned canal administrator, would leave his post. From January 1, 1990, and forever after, the entire canal operation would be led by a Panamanian. But because of uncanny timing, the December 20, 1989 U.S. invasion blocked the designee for administrator, who had been approved by me as the Panamanian head of state in consultation with the Panamanian National Assembly. Instead, the choice was made 11 days later by a man who had been sworn in as president on a U.S. military base at the start of the U.S. invasion, a choice made in happy consultation with his American masters and benefactors. And in 1995, as I wrote about this episode, it was apparent that even the invasion and control of the canal was not enough for some. Jesse Helms, the North Carolina arch-conservative senator who used his position on the Foreign Relations Committee to influence my overthrow, introduced a resolution in the U.S. Congress calling for continued U.S. military presence in Panama beyond the year 2000. Negotiations began right away.